Good day. Today is Wednesday, 31st December 2025. It is in fact New Year's Day. And may I first begin by wishing all of you who follow these programs and have been watching these programs, and all of you who are watching this program, may I take this opportunity to wish you all a very happy New Year. May all that you wish and desire in 2026 come true. May we have peace, finally, a proper, just, sustainable, realistic peace, both in Europe and in all of the other places, the Middle East, Latin America, and all of those places where war either is happening or where it is threatened. And may we also have freedom and security and all of those good things which are, of course, the rights of all people. And to you who've followed me through 2025, may I express my very personal and very great thanks for your attention and your support. And, well, I look forward to providing you with the same kind of commentary that I provided in 2025 over the course of 2026 as well. Now, as you can probably tell, my voice is a bit better today, so that does seem to be in some sort of process of recovery. I have nonetheless been told that I should still avoid making overlong videos, and today I am under particular, shall I say, a particular imperative to keep my video shorter, because I have agreed to spend much of today, New Year's Eve, with my family. Tomorrow I will also be spending New Year's Day itself with my family, and for that reason I will not be making a program tomorrow. So with all of that, let us proceed with the news of today. And precisely because perhaps we are coming up to the end of the year, there's actually, in some respects, less news. Less news does not mean no news. And there's been rumbles and reports of activities and of events taking shape in many places. There have been protests in Iran, which some people in the West have perhaps prematurely rushed to assume presage the collapse of the Islamic Republic there. I don't think so myself. There's a good article on Sonar 21, Larry Johnson's indispensable Substack blog, which explains why, and basically I go along with those reasons. I would merely say that in Iran, protests are far from unusual. Economic stresses, I'm afraid, have been for a very long time, a part of life. And if I may also venture my own opinion, I suspect that some of the problems in the economy, which are made more acute, obviously, by the sanctions, but that there has been some further problems in the economy due to the undisciplined nature of President Pezeshkian's government. I've always felt that he is a well-intentioned man, but I don't think he's perhaps quite the person to bring the kind of discipline to the conduct of Iran's government that Iran needs. And again, I feel that at this particular point in time, at a time when Iran itself continues to be the center of much political pressure, the loss of the former president, Ebrahim Raisi, who was killed in a rather unexplained helicopter crash, continues to be felt by the government and by the political system that exists in Iran at this time. Anyway, I don't propose to say any more. No doubt this will be a topic that Alex and I will discuss in future programs. There are also various claims about attacks by the United States on Venezuela. I actually doubt that these attacks did in fact take place. They've not been reported by either the Venezuelan or the US governments, and there's no overt sign that they happened. But there have been pressures and military activities in all kinds of places. The key event, however, the one that continues to shape the entire international system, remains the conflict in Ukraine. And it seems to me that 2025 has been a decisive year in this regard. It's been a decisive year for three reasons. Firstly, despite endless denials from various people in the West, various commentators in the West, who still want to believe that Russia can be fought to a standstill and that Ukraine, and through Ukraine the West, can prevail in this conflict in some form. Anyway, it seems to me that overall 2025 has for Ukraine been a year of unalloyed military disaster, such that any objective observer can now see that Ukraine is clearly losing the war and is going to lose the war. At the start of the year, we had the fall of the towns of Toretsk, Kurachovo, and Velikaya Novosilka. Then that was followed by the complete collapse of the Ukrainian positions in Kursk region and the loss of Sudzha. Remarkably, this disaster, this extraordinary debacle in Kursk region has been essentially written out entirely from the Western narrative. You barely ever see any mention of it anywhere in the media anymore. And then starting from the summer, the early summer, late spring, early summer, the Russians began their major offensive taking place right across the entire conflict line. And this offensive has been pursued relentlessly ever since, and it has had disastrous effects for Ukraine. So Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Rodinska are now under Russian control. There are still commentators in the West who find it difficult to accept the fact that Ukraine has indeed lost Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians, of course, themselves still claim to hold positions there. But I don't think that any objective observer accepts this anymore. So the Ukrainians lost Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Rodinska. They are now also facing fighting, which continues to be underway in Konstantinovka. There are legitimate doubts about the extent of Russian positions in Konstantinovka. The Russian group of forces tasked with capturing Konstantinovka has variously claimed that they control more than 50% of the buildings in Konstantinovka and 40% of the territory in Konstantinovka. However, there is an extraordinary shortage of film footage that confirms this. And sometimes we get rather detailed accounts from the Russians about the extent of their advances in Konstantinovka. Clearly, fighting is taking place inside Konstantinovka, but I, for one, am going to be very careful before I make any assumptions as to how far advanced the Russians really are in this town. But there is no doubt that sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, especially now that Ukrainian resistance in the Pokrovsk conurbation has collapsed, there is no doubt that sooner or later the Russians will break through and will complete the capture of Konstantinovka. My guess is that it will be wrapped up sometime early in the new year, before the end of winter. If we go further east, further north and further east, then the picture is just as grim. The Russians have captured Siversk, one of the most heavily fortified positions that the Ukrainians have held during the entire period of the war up to now. There have been many Russian attacks on Siversk in the past. All of them have been successfully resisted by the very tough brigade, Ukrainian brigade that was based in Siversk. But this year, the Russians brought together overwhelming forces against Siversk. They methodically cleared all of the villages and forest areas around Siversk. They captured the roads supplying the garrison in Siversk, and they eventually broke into the town and they captured Siversk. Zelensky and Syrskyi and General Gnatov, the chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, have taken all this very badly. And there are reports that the brigade commander who has defended Siversk and another brigade, or at least another senior officer in this area, have both been sacked by Syrskyi because of their failure to defend Siversk effectively and their filing of false reports giving an overly optimistic perspective of the actual situation in the area of Siversk. This, by the way, is an admission, if you wish, that even the Ukrainian military doesn't always get accurate information from its commanders about what is actually taking place on the front lines. And of course, inaccurate information sent by the Ukrainian military commanders on the front lines to the Ukrainian General Staff and to Syrskyi himself eventually reaches Zelensky and is then published and circulated by Zelensky, and as night follows day, it follows its way into the Western media. So just say, having said this, in this particular case, I think that this sacking of these two officers is probably unjust. I say this because anybody who has been following the situation in the Siversk area on the ground with any degree of objectivity could see that sooner rather than later, Siversk would fall. There has been ample drone footage and other footage provided by the Russians and, by the way, by the Ukrainians themselves, which have confirmed the pace of the Russian advance around Siversk. And I can't help but think that what has actually happened in this particular case is that these two commanders have been scapegoated for what was a major Ukrainian defeat, which is now putting in jeopardy the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. And in fact, over the last few hours, there's been more reports of further Russian advances westwards from Siversk, and there are reports that the Russians are now closing in on this big electricity power station that lies somewhere midway between Siversk and Slavyansk. It is still under Ukrainian control. It still supplies electric power to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, but at some point within the next few weeks, or days even, it will no doubt come under the control of the Russians. Anyway, that's the situation in the Siversk area. There is considerable fog of war about the situation in Liman. The Russian Defense Ministry, Gerasimov, and the local area commander claim that they had control around half of Liman. In this case, I believe that they are telling the truth. But again, it's fair to say that there is a lack of drone footage confirming this. Sometimes, and this may be true of Konstantinovka as well, the Russians themselves prefer to restrict drone footage and to restrict reports from a particular place where fighting is taking place, precisely because they are advancing and they don't want the Ukrainians to know what the extent of their advance is. And then we move on to the area where the fog of war has been deepest of all. And of course, I'm now referring to the town of Kupiansk. Now, the Russians back in, I think it was October or November, claimed that they'd captured Kupiansk in its entirety. Zelensky immediately denied this. He then started to say that the Ukrainians had won some major battle in Kupiansk. And then over the course of November and much of December, there's been an endless cascade of reports about a successful Ukrainian counterattack in the Kupiansk area. And of course, Zelensky himself pulled his video stunt. He had himself filmed talking near a stela, which is located outside Kupiansk. He claimed that he'd been inside the town, that he'd congratulated the soldiers there, and that he'd left the town. And as he was leaving the town, he made this video of himself talking. And again, it's been remarkable how many people have taken that video at face value, especially in the West itself. To repeat again, I have no doubt at all that Zelensky's took that video of Zelensky was made in the place and at the time when Zelensky said. But the point is, it was not in Kupiansk. And given that Zelensky claimed that he had been in Kupiansk, I would have expected to see drone footage, or video footage rather, of him there, actually there, if he had really been there. Anyway, the story of Kupiansk is that the Russians say that there is still a large Ukrainian force that is surrounded on the east bank of the Oskol River. They say that they've reduced the perimeter around this force by half. They say that the force now numbers around 2,500 men who are still resisting. The area commander expects this force to have been finally eliminated by sometime in January or early February. In the meantime, the Ukrainians have been launching, or saying they've been launching, various attacks to recapture Kupiansk. They've provided drone footage and geolocations confirming that they have supposedly been in the process of recapturing Kupiansk. The Russian Defense Ministry and the local Russian commander has denied this. The Russians say that they control Kupiansk. They say that every so often small groups of Ukrainian troops infiltrate into the town and have footage is then released of them, and this creates an impression of a Ukrainian counterattack. Anyway, many people have basically been divided as to which side they believe. On balance, I've made many clear many times in many programs, I have believed the Russian account on this question. Now, I've explained why. I've said that this kind of thing has happened before. The Ukrainians very reluctant to admit that a place has actually fallen. They're doing the same with Bakrovsk, by the way, and sending men in from time to time in order to give the impression that serious fighting is still going on there. I suspect that whoever was telling the truth, the days of uncertainty about Kupiansk are coming to an end. At the recent meeting between Putin and his generals, Putin made it clear that he wanted all uncertainty about the situation in Kupiansk to be resolved. The Russians have been releasing more drone footage of their troops in Kupiansk, including a video which appeared over the last 24 hours, which showed Russian soldiers moving through territory in Kupiansk, northeast of Kupiansk, which the Ukrainians claim to have recaptured. There is no doubt that this footage was taken over the last couple of days. it shows heavy snow on the ground, and this time the geolocations do appear to be secure. So I suspect that the Russians are now in the process of tightening up control of Kupiansk. They'd been distracted by the need to commit forces to clear up Ukrainian positions on the east bank of the Oskol, where, as I said, this Ukrainian force is trapped. That meant that Kupiansk itself was not hermetically sealed, if I can put it like that. There's been some claims that the Russian garrison in Kupiansk never numbers more than several hundred men at a time. Anyway, I suspect that time is ending, and before long we will probably see a situation where the fact that the Russians control Kupiansk is no longer in any serious doubt. So that's the situation. In the northern part of the Donbass battles, Kupiansk is actually in Kharkiv, but its control of Kupiansk is important for the Russians as they work towards the encirclement of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. And here I should say that the Russian ambassador to London, Mr. Kalin, who in an interview, I believe given to my friend Ian Proud, has apparently said that the Russians are unlikely to conduct a head-on assault on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. More likely, they are indeed going to work towards the encirclement of these two strategically important towns, the last two big towns that the Ukrainians retain in Donbass. Once Konstantinovka and Druzhivka, the two towns to the south, are captured, which following the fall of Pakrovsk and Chasov Yar to the east is only a matter of time, the Russians will be in a very, very strong position to complete the encirclement of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And then the only question will be whether the Ukrainians, seeing that an encirclement is coming, choose to withdraw from Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, or whether they will decide instead to hold their positions there and to allow what I suspect would be a significant part of the Ukrainian army, several tens of thousands of men in this case, to be encircled by the Russians. And that might well be one of the big stories of 2026. The other big story of 2026 is going to be in the south. The Russians are now moving very fast. In the east, in the eastern Zaporozhye region, they've now captured the town of Gulyapolye. Again, there are denials of this, even though there is absolutely conclusive film footage that the Russians control Gulyapolye, and the Russians have broken through the major defense lines that lie to the east of the remaining important town of Oreshnik. And over the course of Putin's latest meeting with his generals, one which took place 2 days ago on the 29th of December, both Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, and Teplinsky, the Russian general who is in charge of Group of Forces Dnipro, claimed that Russian troops have already entered Oreshnik and street fighting is now taking place inside the town. Now that is difficult to verify, but it is the case that over the last few weeks, the Russians captured two important villages close to Oreshnik, Malaya Tokmachka and Novodanilovka, and it is possible that the Russians have advanced from these villages and have entered Oreshnik itself, with Teplinsky's forces from the west, along the Dnieper, now also spreading eastwards following the fall of the town of Stepnogorsk, and with the Russians continuing their advance on the west, Oreshnik is certain to be surrounded before very long. And in the meantime, General Teplinsky's forces continue to advance up the Dnieper River, on the east bank of the Dnieper River. They have captured apparently most of an important village called Primorske, and according to Teplinsky, they are now within 15 kilometers of the city of Zaporozhye itself. Now, there is not going to be a storming of Zaporozhye city within the next few weeks or months. That will have to wait until Oreshnik is captured and until the Russian forces advancing from the east have properly joined up with General Teplinsky's forces. But at some point in 2026, probably in the late winter or early spring, the battle for Zaporozhye city will begin. It is an absolutely critical city for Ukraine. It is a major industrial center. It is by far the biggest city that the Russians will have attacked up to now. The biggest city the Russians have attacked over the course of the special military operation and captured, incidentally, is the city of Mariupol, which had before the war around 450,000 people. It's bigger than Kherson city. Just to say, if the Russians capture Zaporozhye, they will have captured a major city that used to be a key part of the Soviet industrial complex. It's where the Soviet Union used to build gas turbines and aircraft engines. It would be a massive economic blow to Ukraine. It would bring the Russians to the center of Ukraine, the very heartland of Ukraine. It would bring the Russians to the Dnieper River, here in these very same central regions of Ukraine. And a fact which many people, I think, don't fully understand is that the fall of Zaporozhye city, and there are many reports that Zaporozhye city would be all but impossible to defend on a sustained basis because all of the supplies have to be have to be sent across the bridges from the west bank, most of the city being on the east bank, by far the greater part of the city being on the east bank. Once Zaporozhye falls, this opens the gateway to Odessa and Nikolaev if the Russians choose to move in that direction. Now, this needs to be explained, I think, a little, because Kherson city, which the Russians held in the summer of 2022, the spring and summer of 2022, though which they lost to the Ukrainians in the autumn of 2022, is located a great deal closer to Odessa. And it's also correct that through much of 2022, the Russians controlled all of a Kherson region west of the Dnieper River and came very close to the city, the important shipbuilding city of Nikolaev, which is also located, I believe, on the Dniester River, further to the west of Kherson city. And of course, Nikolaev is not far from Odessa itself. But it's been pointed out many times that an advance along the coast from Kherson to Odessa for an army would be very complicated because we're at a point where various rivers reach the Black Sea. There would be lots of river obstacles to cross, and assuming there was any sort of determined Ukrainian resistance, that resistance would be able to slow down the Russians for a very long time and impose severe costs on the Russians if they had to cross those rivers. Zaporozhye is located further to the north, however, and if the Russians cross the Dnieper in Zaporozhye, if they're able to use the big bridges that connect Zaporozhye city to the West Bank, or if they establish pontoon bridges and that kind of thing, if they establish secure supply routes across the Dnieper, which is not impossible, then there is a clear route using motorways and other means straight to Odessa. And the Russians would in that case also be able to roll up a significant other areas that taken together make up Ukraine's big industrial regions. So the cities of Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog, by the way, is Zelensky's hometown, would be in the way. But then again, if the Russians are across the Dnieper, they would be in a position to advance upon them, and it might be difficult for the Ukrainians to organize a resistance around them. So the fall of Zaporozhye would be a catastrophic blow for Ukraine. It would be an irrecoverable one. If the Ukrainians were to lose the city of Zaporozhye, there would be a real prospect that they would lose the entire Black Sea coast of Ukraine and much of its industry and manufacturing complexes, and of course control of the Dnieper, the whole southern stretches of the Dnieper, would remove from Ukraine its critical transport artery and would create a major crisis, to put it mildly, an unsustainable long-term crisis for Ukraine. It would be difficult to imagine a Ukrainian state functioning effectively across its entire territory in the way that it has been able to do up to now. So the fall of Zaporozhye city, which is now pending, does appear to be at least coming closer over the horizon. And there is no real sign that the Russians are going to stop. Now, there is also a lot of activity now by the Russians in the north of Ukraine, northeastern Ukraine, in Sumy and Kharkiv regions. I'm going to skip discussions of this because there is still massive uncertainty. At least I have great uncertainty as to what it is exactly that the Russians are planning to do there. In Zaporozhye, it is clear, and that the ultimate Russian objective in Odessa is clear, is Odessa. Military objective is Odessa. Is clear to me as well. Putin has now dropped the clearest hint that this is the case when he took the Russian generals and showed them the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg and brought them before the graves of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Peter being the Tsar, the Russian Tsar, who defeated the Swedes in the Battle of Poltava in today's Ukraine, and Catherine the Great being the empress who conquered the entire Black Sea coastline for Russia and who established the cities of Sevastopol and Odessa and Kherson, by the way, as well. So that, it seems to me, is clearly the Russian plan, and they're moving methodically towards achieving it. The Russians also have a complementary military plan, which is the plan that they are carrying out in the sky. Their drones, their ground drones, have become steadily more numerous. They've now introduced many new types of missiles into the war in the sky. We have Kinzhal missiles now used regularly, practically in every Russian missile strike. We have Zircon, hypersonic cruise missiles launched from ships in the Black Sea. And now, of course, we have the Oreshnik being trundled into position. And yesterday was a most interesting day in that respect, because the Russians, for the first time, published film and photographic footage of its transport erector vehicle, the vehicle that transports and launches it. Now, I'm not an expert in these things. You can find the photos if you wish. It doesn't tell me anything about the nature of this missile. But around 10 of them are now based in Belarus. More are entering service every day. And there is every prospect that it will be used, and used in a devastating fashion in attacks across Ukraine, over the course of 2026. And one of these attacks may be imminent. Now, to my bemusement, but not surprise, the Western media, at least the European media, continues to be in complete denial about the Russian claims made yesterday, made the day before yesterday, that Ukraine had launched or attempted to launch a drone attack against Putin's Novgorod residence near the town and lake of Valdai. Now, there's been all sorts of aggressive questions directed at the Russians. Provide proof of this if you can, which is really far from being a good faith question. Because let's assume, for example, that the Russians did provide the Western media with footage of the drones or wreckage of the drones. The Western media would, of course, unite to deny that this was real. They would say that this evidence, such as it was, and it in the nature of things, cannot be convincing. They would argue that this evidence merely proves that the Ukrainian denials must be true. Because Zelensky and Ukrainian officials are denying it, it must be untrue. That seems to be the way in which the Western media is approaching this question. I've noticed that Western governments, by the way, have been far more reticent. They have said all but nothing about this, except, of course, for the government of the United States, which appears to be running with a Russian account. Not just Trump now, but I noticed that the US ambassador to NATO said that this would have been a reckless thing for the Ukrainians to do, which, though not fully unambiguous as words, suggests that the Ukrainians probably did do it. Now, here, let me repeat again points which I made in my video yesterday. Zelensky himself, on Christmas Day, appeared to express a public wish that Putin perish. This was reported in the Western media when it happened. The Ukrainians have a long history of conducting assassinations on Russian territory. This is no longer denied. Even Mediazona now reports the killings of Russian generals in Russia itself by Ukrainian assassins as part of the casualties Russia suffers in the special military operation. And the Ukrainians have used drones to conduct attacks on all kinds of targets, on oil refineries, on ships, on all of those sort of things. And they have shown that they have a great propensity to conduct all kinds of operations of this nature in Russia itself. And mostly, usually, at the beginning, they deny that they are involved when these incidents do take place. So the evidence is not direct, it is circumstantial, and it doesn't categorically prove the Russian story, but it makes the Russian story about the attack on the Valdai residence fully plausible. And as far as I'm concerned, Zelensky's words on Christmas Day all but clinch the matter. I noticed, by the way, that nobody in the West is reminding anybody in the West of those words that Zelensky used. Anyway, the key thing is, what are the Russians going to do? And, well, here it may be that the Oreshnik, the displays of the Oreshnik, tell their own story. The Ukrainian government is apparently giving warnings to various officials in Kiev to vacate the important government buildings that are located there. So there's increasing nervousness and worry about all of this. And anyway, we will see what the Russians do. But that some kind of Russian attack is coming, of that I have no doubt. The Russian Parliament, the Duma, has apparently passed some kind of a resolution saying that it insists this time on direct military action in response to this attack being taken. Now, it has been pointed out that this attack, assuming it did take place, as I believe, would have been happening at exactly the same time that Zelensky was meeting Trump in Miami. And, well, that has annoyed the Russians, unsurprisingly, but it's also infuriated, or it appears to have infuriated, Donald Trump. And that then brings us now to the whole negotiation process that has been underway, because we've had a very interesting article in the New York Times which provides us with some clarity as to much of what has been happening in the negotiations up to now. And we are told, well, there is this very interesting aspect, this very interesting extract from this New York Times article, whose title, by the way, is "The Separation Inside the Unraveling US-Ukraine Partnership." And we're told that over the course of an Oval Office meeting, I'll read the extract. At an Oval Office meeting, still hoping to salvage some equity in Ukraine's territorial concessions, Kellogg offered a plan for a land swap. In this 2+2 plan, Mr. Putin would withdraw from Zaporozhye and Kherson oblasts. Ukraine would relinquish the rest of Donetsk and Lugansk. This plan, Kellogg admitted, was a Hail Mary, and Trump told him Putin probably won't go for it. Still, Trump directed Witkoff, get this to Putin. They met on August 6th. Mr. Putin didn't go for it. He was not about to cede territory voluntarily. But Mr. Witkoff heard what he interpreted as a breakthrough. According to a Trump advisor, the envoy reported back that Mr. Putin had told him, okay, we can't figure out a ceasefire. Here's what we will do. We will do a final peace deal, and that peace deal is the balance of Donetsk. Actually, it was more. In his 3+2 plan, the Russians would also keep Crimea and get the last sliver of Lugansk. Instead of withdrawing from Kherson and Zaporozhye, as Mr. Kellogg had promised, they would keep the territory they'd already conquered. The plan was not the total control Mr. Putin had long demanded, but it was still far more favourable to Russia. And then we're told that at the August meeting in Anchorage, the presidents took no questions, leaving the world to puzzle over what they had agreed on. But according to two Trump advisors, Mr. Putin repeated that he had told what he told Witkoff. He would end the war if he could get the balance of Donetsk. Now, this is most interesting because it tells us a number of things. That the first person to suggest some kind of arrangement with Donetsk and Zaporozhye and Kherson was not Putin, and it was not Witkoff. It was none other than Kellogg himself. That Kellogg, apparently, by this point, had also come to understand that Ukraine was losing the war and that the Russians would not stop the war unless the Ukrainians pulled out of Donetsk. So he suggested to Trump, as a plan, that the Russians be offered all of Donetsk, all of Donbass, but in return they give all of Zaporozhye and all of Kherson back to Ukraine. And Trump said Putin won't buy it, and he sent Witkoff to Moscow, and Putin didn't buy it. But out of that, some kind of story appears to have emerged that Putin in return agreed that the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians did withdraw from Donetsk, there could be some kind of ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. The Russians have never confirmed this. They always continue to insist. Putin continues to insist that all of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions must be transferred to Russia. He repeated this to the generals again at the meetings on 27th December and 29th December of this year, this month in other words. And both he and Gerasimov spoke about the Russian plan to liberate and, in other words, gain control of the city of Zaporozhye. I wonder whether lines got crossed or scrambled in some way, whether Witkoff did indeed come away from the meeting with Putin in Moscow, thinking that Putin was prepared to give up his claims, Russia's claims, to Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and reported this to Trump. I wonder whether there was some embarrassment when it turned out in Anchorage that this was not the case at all, but that the Americans nonetheless said that they would go ahead and try to get the Ukrainians at least to agree to a withdrawal from Donbass. And I wonder whether it might have been the realization that Putin has not agreed to a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson region that may have caused some of the problems that we saw between the Americans and the Russians over the course of the autumn. Just saying. Anyway, this is my guess. Obviously, I'm not in the room, but I can see what the Russians are saying, and I have no doubt at all that the Russians remain committed to at least the capture of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and, well, their longer term plan, I've no doubt, involves Odessa as well. So anyway, that's where we are. Now that brings us back to the negotiations, and it bears repeating again that the negotiations that took place in Miami between Trump and Zelensky went nowhere at all. Zelensky refused to withdraw, even from Donbass, even from Donetsk, let alone Zaporozhye and Kherson region. He still insists on impossible demands. He still gives every impression of wanting the war to continue until the United States exerts itself, as he appears to assume it can, and forces the Russians into some kind of capitulation, something which of course will never happen. But at least that seems to me very much Zelensky's game plan at the moment, and it's the one that the Europeans are supporting him in. I don't get any sense that the negotiations are moving anywhere forward, and I don't think that the Ukrainians are able to make the kind of concessions that Putin is demanding that they make, and that the Americans are saying that they must make. Clearly, the meeting in Miami, which took place a few days ago, did not go well. Ushakov has told us that the Americans told Zelensky that he must drop all ideas about ceasefires and freezes. He must accept at least the principle of territorial withdrawals. He must agree on an unconditional withdrawal from Donbass, and must, at the very least, accept that there won't be a ceasefire, but instead a move to a final settlement. And Zelensky dug in his heels and said no. And I don't think this is going to change. And I think that we're going to see the war continue, and it will not be, before long, the Russians will indeed be in control of the whole of Donbass, and they will be at the gates of Zaporozhye city itself, and they will be, at some point, if Zaporozhye city falls, crossing the river and advancing towards Odessa, taking in Kryvyi Rog and Nikopol as well. That, it seems to me, is far and away the most likely prospect. The big question is, once it becomes clear that Zelensky is never going to negotiate in those terms, and once it becomes clear that there is no one else in Kiev who is prepared to make those kind of concessions, and that the Russians are indeed going to break through, and that the kind of military events that are taking place are going to happen, the big question then is, what is the West going to do? The same, by the way, applies to the financial question. The Ukrainians have now been promised another 90 billion euros, which are going to be provided through a bond issue. 90 billion euros, as I've said, is not going to get the Ukrainians through the year. Ian Proud, at his excellent Substack site, The Peacemonger, has written a piece in which he predicts that sometime in the summer, just as I predict sometime in the summer, Ukraine is going to run through the 90 billion euros, and they're going to come back demanding more money. Of course, Zelensky is already demanding more money. And I'm going to guess, Ian Proud guesses, and I'm sure he's right, that at that point, the agitation, the pressure in Europe to misappropriate the Russian funds in Euroclear will resume, and we will have more demands and more cries to do this, and more criticism of anybody who's standing in the way. And there will be people who will say in Europe and in the media that we can't afford to betray Ukraine now when they have the Russians at the door and the money has run out, and we must therefore come after the Russian assets. There is a real possibility, and I think this is something we must unfortunately all prepare for, that sometime in the summer there's going to be a confluence of events that is going to escalate this crisis to levels which we have never seen up to now. The first will be when the Russians surround the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and attempts to pretend that the Ukrainians are holding out in Donbass are exposed as untrue, and the moment when the Russians reach Zaporozhye city and begin to lay siege to it. And of course, if Zaporozhye city falls and the Russians cross the Dnieper, that can also be a moment when, as I said, the hysteria and the anger in Europe and on the part of some people in Washington will escalate to extraordinary dimensions. And it will also be at that moment, that could be the precise same moment, when the Ukrainians themselves begin to run out of money and come back and demand from the West more money. And perhaps they don't just ask for money in this critical situation. They ask for some kind of direct Western intervention in the war. President Trump continues to rule out boots on the ground, US boots on the ground. President Zelensky, however, has now contradicted him. He says that President Trump is considering placing US boots on the ground. So, well, I don't believe that President Trump is seriously considering that option, but we can already see how the pressure is going to start and is going to build. And, well, there's been a meeting, apparently, of national security advisors from Ukraine and from the European states, from Macron's and Starmer's so-called coalition of the willing. And, well, one wonders exactly what they're talking about. Probably Zelensky wants to brief the Europeans on his meeting with Trump, but we can imagine definitely that there will still be attempts to patch together, cobble together some kind of intervention force to send to Ukraine over the next few weeks and months. So it could be that even as Ukraine goes down, the war might be entering in 2026 its most dangerous period. And it could be doing that right in the middle of the midterm elections in the United States, or rather the campaign for the midterm elections in the United States. And it's inconceivable that were that to happen, the crisis in Ukraine would not become an issue in the midterms as well. So this is going to be potentially a very rocky situation next year. Moreover, it's now obvious that the US government is not united in any form on seeking any kind of negotiated outcome with the Russians. The same New York Times article, which talked about the negotiations with the Russians, the attempt to cobble together deals with the Russians, tells us that the CIA, under CIA Director Radcliffe, has been working overtime to support Ukraine's sabotage operations against Russia. Now, this is interesting to me because, of course, the Russians consistently blame the British for what the Ukrainians are doing. It's often seen to me that it's always been more likely that it was the Americans, because the Americans have far more resources here. And though the British would no doubt love to be involved, they just don't have the means anymore to do all of the things that the Americans say, that the Americans can, though no doubt the British chip in when we can. But anyway, we learned that the Central Intelligence Agency and the US military, with Trump's blessing, supercharged a Ukrainian campaign of drone strikes on Russian oil facilities and tankers to hobble Mr. Putin's war machine. Where Mr. Hegseth, that's the US War Secretary, I suppose we must now call him, had marginalized his Ukraine-supporting generals, CIA Director Radcliffe had consistently protected his own officers' efforts for Ukraine. He kept the agency's presence in the country at full strength. Funding for its programs there even increased. When Trump ordered the March aid freeze, the US military rushed to shut down all intelligence sharing, but Mr. Radcliffe explained the risk facing CIA officers, and surprise, surprise, the White House allowed the agency to keep sharing intelligence about Russian threats inside Ukraine. And then we're told that the CIA had a plan to at least buy time to make it harder for the Russians to capitalize on Ukraine's extraordinary moment of weakness. This is the moment, presumably, when the US, this is in March, when the US military stopped intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And we're then told that a powerful tool employed by the Biden administration, supplying attackers and targeting intelligence strikes, targeting intelligence for strikes inside Russia, had been effectively pulled off the table. This is again an example of how the media in the West reports these events, because yes, there were attack-em strikes conducted against Russia, but they were totally ineffective. They failed to achieve anything significant at all. But then we're told that a parallel weapon remained in place, permission for CIA military officers to share targeting intelligence and provide other assistance for Ukrainian drone strikes against crucial components of the Russian defense industrial base. These included factories manufacturing energetics, chemicals used in explosives. And we're then told that the energy strikes would come to cost the Russian economy as much as $75 million a day, according to a US intelligence estimate, which, by the way, confirms that they failed, because for an economy the size of Russia and for an energy complex the size of Russia, $75 million is small change. The operation was ultimately a failure. There is no sign that it was successful. And by the way, for the record, I doubt that it was as much as $75 million a day. But they have to report back that they're having success. And so we got all the smoke from the refineries, and we got all the stories in the media, which I'm going to guess were planted to give the impression that Ukraine was indeed conducting this successful campaign. And of course it wasn't. So here we see the Trump administration in action, simultaneously at one and the same time, trying to find a way to negotiate with the Russians, making proposals which always fall far short of Russian objectives, and at the same time assisting the Ukrainians to conduct drone attacks deep inside Russia. Now the big question is, and this article inevitably leads us to this point, was the drone attack that the Russians say was conducted against Putin's residence in Valdai, also assisted by the Americans. President Trump is shocked that this attack took place whilst he was meeting with Zelensky. Other officials in the American government also seem unhappy that it took place. But to me, this article in the New York Times all but confirms again that the CIA is, well, I won't say a rogue organisation, but very much a law unto itself, able to get the president to authorise all kinds of cloak and dagger activities, very difficult to control. Is it not possible that somebody from the CIA, that the CIA played a role here? Now, there have been claims that the whole operation against Valdai was actually carried out with Trump himself involved, that he was playing some sort of extraordinarily duplicitous and incredibly ruthless game, telling Putin to wait his call so as to keep Putin in the same place in Valdai, and then, even as he was talking to Zelensky, letting his intelligence people assist the Ukrainians to conduct a strike against Putin in Valdai. The fundamental problem I have with that claim is that I don't believe that Putin was in Valdai at all. I am confident that Putin was in the Kremlin. He has certainly been in the Kremlin over the last few days, and I don't myself believe he was in Valdai at that time. I don't believe this story. I think that Trump and the people around him, Witkoff and Kushner, would know that the assassination of Putin would not decapitate Russia's leadership. It would provoke instead a massive reaction from Russia and could set in train an uncontrolled escalation. And as I said, Putin's own whereabouts argue against this story. And for the record, I don't believe that Putin has to remain in the same place in order to receive a call from Trump. I don't see why he can't receive this call from his phone, for example, on the secure phone in his aircraft, or in whichever other residence he moves to, or in his special train, which also exists. So I think that there are too many problems with this story, and I don't myself give credence to it. What I think Trump does need to understand, though, is that questions like this will always be asked about him, and doubts will always exist about him, whilst he continues to give the CIA the green light to conduct operations of this kind. The Americans have a habit of doing this thing. I can remember how during the Vietnam War negotiations, the United States, even as it was simultaneously trying to negotiate with the North Vietnamese the terms of its exit from the Vietnam War, was actually escalating and expanding the war. The result was not good for the United States in any way. It merely prolonged the war and made the eventual defeat worse. And of course, it created major problems between the Vietnamese and the Americans in the negotiations. And if the Americans adopt the same course, it will do the same for them in these very difficult negotiations they want to conduct, or appear to want to conduct, with the Russians. I'm going to finish this program by saying this. My overall sense is that in the United States, there are enough people now, both within the administration and outside it, who understand that the war is lost, that Putin is not going to lose the war, that Russia is not going to lose the war, that there's not going to be regime change in Moscow. And despite excited articles about the fact that the Russian central bank, has been doing some engaging in some entirely conventional operations to maintain liquidity in the banking system using repo auctions. The Russian economy is not going to collapse this year or next year or the year after. So the United States does need in some way to detach itself from this war. It would like to pass the burden of the war onto the Europeans, but the Europeans know that they cannot, and they've been trying for that reason to keep the United States involved. But the imperative for the United States to detach itself from the war remains. Given the likely crisis that we are going to see in the war at some point next year, and given the enormous danger and overheated rhetoric and hysteria and demands for extreme actions that are inevitably going to come, it is essential that the United States keeps not just secure and stable contacts with the Russians, but that these contacts are not clouded by anger and frustration on the Russian side because of this cloak and dagger war that the CIA insists on conducting. It is not achieving anything. It is merely causing anger and distrust in Moscow, even if the $75 million a day price is real, which I doubt. It is a pinprick for the Russians, and nothing more, but also further confirmation to the Russians that the Americans cannot be completely trusted. So, my final word of advice to the President of the United States, which is of course ridiculous because he doesn't listen to these programs, and I don't expect that he's going to follow this advice because the Americans remain addicted to this sort of thing. But my best advice to the President is to call in Mr. Ratcliffe, tell him this hasn't achieved anything. There's no sign that this has affected either the Russian economy or the Russian war effort at all. Our attempts to choke off Russian energy exports have been a complete failure. This is the moment we stop. We stop. We are disengaging. You are trying to involve us in something that we are going to lose and which we need to distance ourselves from. That is the message that the President should give to his CIA chief, and he should make sure that the CIA chief acts on it. Well, of course, I am talking about an eventuality which will never occur. I don't believe that Trump is going to have that kind of conversation with Ratcliffe, and even if he did, I suspect that Ratcliffe and the CIA would go on doing exactly the same thing that they have done before, and I don't think the President will do enough to bring them back into line. But it has always been my practice to point out that where there are bad alternatives, there are also better ones. And where there are bad choices, there are also other choices which, even if they are not optimal, are certainly a lot better than the bad choices that are being made. Here, there is a very clear and obvious choice. Ukraine is going down. Nothing is being achieved by persisting in the dirty war. It can only create problems with the Russians in the future. both the Americans and the British, if they are involved, which at some level I'm sure they are, need to take a step back and close it all down. Anyway, that's my program for today. My last program for 2025. To repeat again, may I wish you all a very happy new year. Next program will be in 2026. Let me remind you again for the last time this year to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. And of course, if you want to support our work, please do so via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. And remember, you can also find all our work and more on our Substack site. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And again, a happy 2026.